So in my next video, I'm going to show you how I made these, and what these are wooden copies of this, which is a metal machinist vise that is not mine. I borrowed it for this video, but it's usually used with a drill press, and the throat of it is pretty small. The jaw opening is not very large, and it's also not scale what I'm used to working with. So I copied this, I copied all the dimensions and blew them up. These are about twice as big, but a little wider than twice as big as this one. And I made two versions. I made a plywood version and then a nicer hardwood version. They both work really well. They didn't cost me anything because I had all the materials in my shop. But if you had to buy stuff, you could easily make this, I think, for under 50 bucks. And I've already started editing the videos, and they're longer than I thought they would be. So I'm going to post one video of making the plywood version and one video of making the hardwood version. And if you want to learn how to make this, you don't have to watch both of them. The plywood version has a little more information. The making of them is a little bit different, but I don't think different enough that you'd have to watch both of them. The other reason I wanted to use this, besides using on the drill press, which is nice because with the long handles you could hold this firmly while you're drilling into it, but also because I've been doing a lot of carving lately and I wanted something that could hold oblong shapes and the odd shapes I've been working with for power carving. Specifically made the plywood frame for this one first, and that is because this one, since it was plywood, I didn't mind the fact that I lost all this material on the top as well as the bottom, but I didn't want to throw away all of that nicer hardwood. So now I know the heights and the depth of my two edges, as well as the height and depth of these two sides, which I'm going to start calling runners. And I actually have cherry that's just about the exact perfect size for both those pieces. So you could see that this is actually maybe an 1/8 inch shallow, but I could adjust this opening to account for that. And then these two edge pieces are perfectly 2 inches thick, so these could be my two edges. Now on this one, I'm making it traditionally like this, where the top is going to be flat. On the cherry one, I want to make it more like a bench vise with the rounded over tops, which will give me more gripping power for bigger pieces. These pieces I'm using are leftovers from other pieces, so you can see that it's already jointed and planed. It's really flat just by gauging it off the edge of my table saw fence. And the same is going to go for this one. They're also thicker pieces of lumber. They're not standard sizes. So if you're buying lumber for this, you're probably going to have to joint it and plane it to get it square, and you might even save some money by laminating pieces together instead of buying thicker things. Just some rough measurements for anyone that doesn't conveniently have almost the perfect size pieces on their wood rack. The plywood base is about 12 inches long by about 5 inches wide, 3 inches tall. This runner right here is about 1 3/4 and also goes by 12 because I'm going to be putting this together in 4 pieces, 1, 2, 3, 4, which means my cherry, which is just about the perfect size, this one right here is 2 inches wide by 1 1/4 inches thick, and then this one over here is also 2 inches wide by a little over 4.5 inches thick, but I don't know if I'm going to use that whole width yet. So this build went a little bit quicker because I had already started on the plywood one, and I just kind of ripped that down to shape and then dimensioned all my lumber. So same process, that thickness is about the same, and then it's about 13 inches long, and then my 2 blocks, same process. They were, I think, about 4 or 5 inches tall, and then by about 5 inches wide. You can see I'm just cutting all my pieces down to size. And then before I attach my pieces, I cut a little 45 off the top of that stationary piece just because it would be easier to do. Setting these cuts up were pretty easy. I just set my blade to the depth of both sides, thickness of them as well. So this piece is actually like 1 inch and 15/16, so that's where I set my stop at. I'm going to make this a little bit darker so that you could see it. And then I just double checked where I made those marks. Putting that there, sliding it forward. And you can see that that blade's going to cut pretty much perfectly where I had it lined up. So it's going to take a little bit of time. It's going to be a lot of kerfs. But with this blade and with this fence, I'll get nice, clean, square cuts, so it's worth it. So I'm cutting all these kerfs because I'm going to be lap joining the rails to my stationary jaws in order to make for a much more solid joint than butt joints. So these are going to rest inside those rails. Now you're going to lose a lot of material when you cut out that middle section, but it was still a nice solid joint. And then once I had all those curves, I could easily clean it up with a chisel. So you could see that now those fit together nice and flush, and since I cut those on the table saw, the cuts were pretty perfect, so I just put some glue on it, some C-clamps in all the corners, made sure everything was square, and let it set up overnight. So like I said, because I'm going to be removing a lot of that solid inner portion of the material, I have a huge stack of 5/8 inch dowels, and I just drilled some holes and cut some dowels to reinforce my four corners for when I take out that center material. Bottom of this metal one has these grooves, and then it's hard to tell, but the jaw is one piece and it goes all the way down to this bottom groove, and then there's simply just another piece of metal on top of that which keeps the jaw from coming out but also keeps it in place. So in order to make these grooves, I originally multiplied all the numbers like I have been on this whole piece and did it on the plywood. It's not a ton of math, but it's enough that I don't want to do it again. So in order to get it on my cherry, I simply just traced my opening. These tolerances, as far as being too big or too small, I don't think are super imperative for blowing up this piece. Like I said, you could kind of tell now that this is in place. You could see that one piece just comes down to the bottom and another piece goes on top of it and keeps it all in place. So if these are off by a little bit, it's not going to make a huge difference because you're making all of these pieces yourself. So right here I'm telling you how I'm probably going to insert the plywood portion of the video in here for the measurements, which I'm not going to do because one of the reasons is I'm measuring off the plywood is thicker, so the measurements are actually a little wrong. You'll be able to see in the video I don't cut to that height, so instead here's just a sketch of the inner dimensions for the cherry. But cutting this out was the same as the plywood. I had that just off center of the center of my cherry piece, so I could use a 3/4 inch dado stack to cut it and then just flip it, and it cuts that groove centered. So now I have that perfect groove in the middle. And then I went through and cut the sides the same way. By having it slightly off center, you could keep flipping the piece and get a mirror image on both sides. So then I had some scrap of cherry, and this is going to be the movable part of the vise. So the hardware for this is going to be a 5/8 inch threaded rod and a coupling for it, and the coupling is about 7/8 of an inch. So in order to line up my holes, I drill a very small 7/8 of an inch counterbore hole, so that after I drill the 5/8 inch hole, which I'm doing right now through the whole piece, I could come back and finish drilling that 7/8 inch hole through the stationary jaw in order to keep everything aligned. So once I had that minor hole and then the 5/8 inch hole, I clamped the movable jaw onto place so that that hole will go all the way through. I couldn't use my end boring jig for this because the bulk of it stuck out too far. It wouldn't work with it, so that's why I kind of have it propped up. And then for the coupling, on this one I decided to make it flush, so I just trimmed off the edge of it, and then this is drilling the bottom holes in the movable jaw. And right about here, I think it was here, was when I realized I never put the bottom part on the movable jaw. So I had to completely remake this piece. So here's me with the new piece, and on this one I had enough depth that I could cut it so it goes below the two rails on the side. That's marking the depth of my rails, and then kerfing out those two sides. The original on the plywood, I didn't mess up this part. So that's, and now this will sit below the rails like it's supposed to. So at the end of the day, this is actually what this should look like, and it fits in here quite nicely. I'm going to put the 45 on this as well, but I'm probably not going to film it because I'm most likely going to keep that mistake in the video. It slides all the way back out. There's the slightest amount of play in this piece. The plywood one really didn't have any play. I don't think that's going to make a difference. I would like it if it was completely snug, but like I said, I don't think there's going to be a difference. And in fact, it might actually help with seasonal humidity if there is a little bit of play. So now what I have to do is re-drill my hole. You can also see on the bottom that piece is nice and flush. It's pretty much perfectly aligned with that top edge of that groove. And in order to realign my holes, I took my coupling out. I'm going to use the bit I used to drill it to kind of mark where center is. Probably draw an outline as well, and then re-drill that 5/8 inch hole. So I ended up getting that realigned as best as I could with what I had left. You could see it's pretty centered. So then once I had that, I re-drilled the holes in the bottom, and the holes in the bottom came off 3/4 of an inch from the back. They were 5/16 inch holes because I'm going to put T-nuts in here. And then I just counterbored the holes slightly so the thickness of the T-nut would fit in there. And then I slow-mode this so I have enough time to add the talking because I lost this footage when I made the mistake. And then I just use these alignment pins, these 5/16 alignment pins, in order to transfer those marks to the plate that goes on top of this. So then here's that plate, and I can align it and then push it down, and I get my marks for my holes, which ended up being perfectly square, which was a good sign. And then I could drill those on the drill press as well. And then this is the same process as the plywood. I'm putting one T-nut in the bottom, which I realized I didn't need, but it wasn't until after I already did this. And then another 1/4 inch hole in the back. I used some white paint with that threaded rod in my 5/8 hole and the movable jaw in order to figure out where to cut that groove. And then with a thick disc on my angle grinder, I just kind of shaped that divot in the piece in order to use this. So then a shorter screw goes in the back, and a longer screw that's shaped on the top goes in the front. It fits into that groove so the threaded rod can't come out. I've been grinding away at this, and I'm probably going to put this in the plywood video as well because the way I mocked this one up was much easier than the plywood one. The plywood one, I had all my hardware in my holes, so I was constantly screwing and unscrewing the screws to make incremental changes. So on this one, I kept the coupling, the threaded coupling out, so I could just keep sliding this back into place. So I don't have to screw that in. And then I kept the T-nuts out of here, so I could test fit all my pieces without those. So you could just slide that into place. This one was lucky. I had like the perfect size bolt, which was already tapered on the top for it. Could just put this in place and then test it out like that. So this moves forward, but you can't pull it out of the cherry. So it's just much easier to test it out that way. So if this was off, you could even sort of see in the hole, make sure that your grinding lines up, and just keep popping this in and out. Much easier. Also, you don't really need the threaded nut in this bottom piece. I think I originally did that just because on the metal one, it's threaded all the way through both pieces. But if you have the two T-nuts here, it's going to grab. I already have the recess there, so I'm just going to put it in there, but I don't actually think you need one there, just on these two pieces. So once I had that working, just like the plywood version, I epoxied everything in place. So I hammered my T-nuts in, and then I just applied some epoxy. You could use threaded inserts for this. I prefer T-nuts, but they will pull out because they're not really designed for a bunch of torque. So the epoxy will keep everything in place. And once that was epoxy in place, I could test it out. It seemed to be working, so I epoxied the coupling in as well. The handle for this I had laying around, so I didn't make one, and you could kind of see in the video I ended up screwing it off square, so I had to elongate the hole a little bit So in order to attach it, I put a bunch of epoxy in the hole and then made sure I lined it vertically and let all that set up, and it ended up working out. So then I drilled a little bit bigger than a 1/4 inch hole in the back, and I cut the heads off of some 1/4 inch carriage bolts. And I've been practicing my turning, so I had some turned beads laying around, and I drilled 1/4 inch holes in those, and then with those little knobs I could attach them to either end of that 1/4 inch bolt, and then I had a nice little movable leverage turner at the tail end of both my pieces. I put removable jaws on both of these projects so that if you mar up the jaws, you could just replace them and not ruin the whole vise. For this one, I had some 1/4 inch maple laying around, so that went on the cherry one. I eventually might put some grooves in here. I'm just drilling 4 holes centered up pretty nicely, and then I countersunk holes in those and attached them to the cherry with some screws. And I eventually might put some grooves in these for gripping, but if I don't need them yet, so I'm not adding them until I need them, then I could attach both of those to my pieces. To finish these up, I just used a belt sander to kind of smooth out all the pieces. These weren't really in the need of a ton of sanding, so this was a pretty easy step. And then the finish for these, I put General Finishes clear finish on all the pieces. On the cherry, I ended up putting it on the rails once just to get a nice even coat, but on the entire outside, I think I did 3 coats. All my finished pieces, I ended up putting only about 1 coat of finish on any part that's going to touch sliding parts, because you don't want the finish to build up. In fact, this one was a hair loose, and because I put a layer of finish on the inside and a layer of finish on that, this one's actually quite snug now. I didn't have that problem on this one because I didn't coat the Teflon. So this morning I went through and I put wax on all my sliding parts, and I'll probably reapply that wax as time goes by, but now everything moves really nicely in these two. And I let them set out for a couple days just because if you put them together too soon, the finish will stick. But I have a coat of wax on all the touching parts, so I think I should be fine. And now I'm going to just reassemble these and see if they can hold things. And then the plywood one moves really smoothly. The cherry one is a little rough, I think just because of the humidity. It's the middle of the summer, and also I think when I re-drilled that hole, it was slightly off. It still works. You can see it holds pieces. I think once the humidity goes down, it will move much smoother. That doesn't render it unworkable. It's just not as smooth as the plywood, which is to be expected because the plywood isn't going to be subjected to the changes that humidity brings about in wood as much as the cherry.